Good afternoon. I'm George Blumenthal, the Chancellor at UC Santa Cruz, and I'd like to welcome you all here today. This event is a highlight of the year for me every year, and this year it's a signature event in our annual Founders Day celebration as we celebrate the 45th anniversary of the opening of this campus. We're also celebrating today 10 years of the annual Matra Lecture. 10 years of lectures by outstanding people, writers, academics, artists, Nobel laureates, and economists. They've all been outstanding, they've all been intellectually enriching, and we've been able to put them on because of the sponsorship of our donors and of the UC Santa Cruz Foundation. So I very much look forward to today's lecture by the author of The Difficulty of Being Good, something that my children lectured me on many times when they were younger. But my main job today is to introduce and thank Anu Luther. We owe our thanks for this lecture series to one woman, Anu Luther Matra, who established this lecture series in honor of her late husband, Sid. Sid was a truly Renaissance man with a broad range of interests, and Anu has kept that up as a dedicated humanist herself with a goal of enriching the campus community and the community surrounding the campus as well. Anu has been an enormously good friend of UC Santa Cruz. She is currently a trustee of the UCSC Foundation, and she was formerly, a couple of years ago, the president of the UC Santa Cruz Foundation. So please join me in welcoming Anu Luther Matra, who will tell you about today's Matra Lecture and the entire Matra Lecture series, and especially about today's distinguished speaker. So welcome, Anu Luther.
Thank you, Chancellor. Your university has very consciously and generously supported this series. Also, given the paucity of such programs in the country, you have consciously made a high-level commitment to create a world-class interdisciplinary center for South Asia studies. All 10 lectures in this series have been attended by the university's chancellor. In itself, an amazing record. Thank you, Chancellor Blumenthal, and thank you, Dr. Weisberg, for again being here today. Thank you, Vice Chancellor Murphy, for the ready and full support of your Office of University Relations. And thank you, Director McCrow, for your dedication and meticulousness. Thank you also, Dean Kamienecki, for your excellent stewardship of the South Asia program. And thank you, George and Kelly, Donna and Anne, Sheldon, for your friendship. Welcome to our 4F audience, friends and family, first-timers and fans of this series. This is an intensely personal series named for my husband who died suddenly and too young. The founding endowment was provided by friends, Kiran and Arjun Malhotra, and it is an attempt to preserve, sometimes interpret the values, ideals, and passions of a remarkable man. Over the years, we have brought to you a sparkling array of thinkers, but a bewildering variety of topics. Vikram Seth, Vlad Godzic, Nazir Jarazbhoy, Pico Iyer, Partha Mehta, Sharmila Tagore, Amartya Sen, Shashi Tharoor, Marty Hellman, Edward Luce. They have spoken of friendship and poetry, the power of reason, the shared values that lie at the intersection of all religions, poetic realism, nuclear disarmament, global warming, world terrorism. Wildly different subjects, yes, but all skillfully crafted and contemporary moralities of understanding, tolerance, and universalism. But today, our speaker will take us aboard his crystal Vimana, a magic ship that flies wherever his thoughts take him, to a time some 3,000 years ago, referred to as a crack between the ages, ushering in our modern era, Kali Yuga, as it is called in the Mahabharat. The Mahabharat, one of the two great epic poems of Hinduism, is at 100,000 couplets, 7 times as long as Iliad and Odyssey combined. It is a story of a great war that was fought at Kurukshetra in northern India. In the story itself, there is a clear forward momentum and a preordained chronological thread, but it also has a feel of Russian nested dolls, multiple layers of meaning and stories within stories. Growing up in India, we all had a multimedia exposure to the sub-stories told to us by our grandmothers, read by us in what we call storybooks, and captured for us on TV and film. For the more determined and curious, there are various abridged translations of the epic from the Sanskrit. In this form, the Mahabharata reads like an entirely consistent amalgamation of Harry Potter and Star Trek, Iliad and Odyssey, the Bible and I Ching, Grimm's fairy tales, The Prince, and even the Kama Sutra. There are fantastical monsters and asura demons, magic Nag Amrit potions, silver horses and underwater serpent kings, powerful gods and their mischievous avatars, crystal ships and gold chariots, morality tales, war strategies and political machinations, arduous physical treks and voyages of self-discovery, carnal desire and great love, romantic, filial, parental. Story-wise, the entire first half of the Mahabharata is a lead-up to the war, and then there is the war. But in the middle of the Sturm und Drang, the restless, ceaseless action of the epic is the stillness of the Gita, the song of supreme wisdom, the mystical essence of Hindu theology that, founded on an axiomatic definition of the universe, provides us a common sense guide for living our lives according to the principles of Dharma. A word untranslatable according to Mr. Das, but I know he's going to give it a shot today. I'll also leave it up to him to describe the electrifying conditions under which, in a chariot between two armies frozen in time, we get the Gita. Perhaps I should explain why I am entrusting this task to him. He graduated with honors from Harvard University with a degree in PPS, politics, philosophy, and Sanskrit, but later made up for the lack of an E for economics by attending Harvard Business School. He had a distinguished career in business. He was CEO of Procter Gamble India and managing director of P&G Worldwide. Today, he is a much sought-after management guru. But in what his grandmother called his third stage melancholy, he took early retirement to devote himself to 2 solitary pursuits, reading and writing, in many different genres and for every kind of print media. He writes regular columns for multiple Indian newspapers and guest columns for the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Financial Times. His books include a novel, A Fine Family, a book of essays, The Elephant Paradigm, 3 English plays, and so on. India Unbound, his international bestseller, is a masterly alchemy of historical account, economic analysis, sociocultural observations, and personal narrative. The New York Times wrote, "Something tremendous is happening in India," and Das, with his keen eye and elegant prose, has his finger firmly on the pulse of transformation. His stories enliven what could easily have been a dull piece of economic history. His latest book, The Difficulty of Being Good, The Subtle Art of Dharma, is again the kind of multi-layered writing he has perfected. He selects 8 central characters of the Mahabharata to give us scholarly, insightful, and cosmopolitan discourses on their strengths, their failings, and their angst, their dilemmas, and their ruses. And then, modern man that he is, he gives us contemporary apps: socialism, Nazism, feminism, slavery, public corruption and accountability, the justification for war, the concept of reciprocal altruism, and so on. In fact, the book itself is so fascinating, and he is such a wonderful storyteller, that Chancellor and I have requested him that he not confine himself to the Dharma of Capitalism, especially for this audience, but discuss the concept of Dharma in its many different and full contexts, as suggested in the Mahabharat. Gurcharan's India Unbound addresses artha, material well-being. The difficulty of being good tackles dharma, moral and spiritual fitness. May we hope that next we will see his take on desire, the third limb of life, and that we will soon see his version of the Kama Sutra. For us here, Gurcharan carries on a tradition of distinguished speakers who have sworn fealty to the Dharma of the series, a rational humanism that transcends borders, peoples, and time. But what I have found most endearing about him is his Kshatriya-like bravery, something that characterizes much of what he does. He boldly chucked aside a brilliant career to follow his urges into an uncertain world of journalism. He fearlessly follows his conscience to take on malfeasant, misguided, manipulative politicians and businessmen, not just the general class of them, but specific named, powerful individuals. Gurcharan acts according to his duty. He was to the manner of writing born, and he does so according to the dictates of his conscience. On a personal note, this year, in the context of this named lecture, our family also confronted a dilemma. My daughter worried that her father was an uncompromisingly modern man, a rationalist who taught his kids that moral guidelines don't have to reside in religion. The issue has recently become particularly interesting for her in her new role as a mother to Ryan, whom you've been hearing from to the left of this audience. My son recalled that his father did love the stories of the Mahabharat, but for him they were just that, stories. The scientist in him would have celebrated another axiomatic view of the universe, and Stephen Hawking's recent pronouncement that the universe can and will create itself from nothing, that it was not necessary to invoke a god to get things going. It remained for Sid's friends to provide a resolution. Sid, they say, lived a life devoted to the pursuit of knowledge, but he did it without arrogance. He acted vigorously to acquire material comforts, but had little attachment to what he dismissively called things. And he always had a yogic immersion in now, this moment. I suppose in his own way, and perhaps in spite of himself, Sid too was a dharmic man. And I think he would have wished this for Ryan too, her own journey, but the same destination. This series is also thus an introduction for Ryan to a grandfather she will not have the privilege to meet. It may seem like this grandmother is ceding her responsibilities, but she is certainly very happy to start Ryan off in this community with Gurcharan holding her hand. And thus, I give to you Mr. Gurcharan Das.
Thank you, Rana. You do me honor by inviting me here to one of the most beautiful spots on the earth, as well as an event which has got such a fine legacy. Anu called me a management guru, and I want to hastily explain that my idea of such a guru is one who's good at understanding, GU, but relatively useless. However, my name also contains the word guru, so this is a problem. But it wasn't always so. Until the age of 3, my name was Ashok Kumar, which means Prince of Happiness. But my grandmother suspected that my mother gave me this name because she thought my mother was secretly in love with the Bollywood actor Ashok Kumar. So this would not do. And she took me to her guru and placed me at his feet, and she said to give this boy a name. And he gave me the name Gurcharan Das. And so overnight, I was transformed from the Prince of Happiness, Ashok Kumar, to the humble servant of the feet of the Guru, which is what my name means. Now, in India, people take their names seriously. It's not like, Tom, Dick, and Harry. It's mothers agonize for months about names. And the Guru, I think, was also sending me a message, which was about the virtues of humility. And I must say, in my long career, I've met many leaders, business as well as political leaders. And I believe the best ones had 2 qualities. One was determination, fierce determination. And the second was not intelligence. That's an overrated virtue in a leader. It was humility. Oh, they were ambitious, but their ambition was for their work, for their companies, or for whatever they were doing. Anyway, I wrote this book that Anu mentioned, India Unbound, in which I predicted the economic rise of India. Now, if I was that kind of person, I would be saying to you today, 10 years later, I told you so. Clearly, even I did not imagine that India would grow for 5 successive years at almost 9%. And now it's quite clear to everybody that we have entered into a golden age of growth. And frankly, nothing can really stop it. And India, too, will turn into a middle-class country. So that's the good news. The bad news is that this prosperity that is spreading in the midst of the most appalling governance. When I speak about governance, I'm not thinking of a politician, or only thinking of a politician who's caught with a bribe, or a CEO who is being less than ethical. I'm thinking of how governance affects the poor, ordinary people. You shouldn't have to bribe somebody to get a birth certificate. 1 out of 4 school teachers in a government primary school in India is absent, and 1 out of 4 who is present is not teaching. And out of the 3.7 million government primary school teachers, these teachers are being paid a salary of 22,000 rupees, which, if you have to think about it, is 7 times our India's per capita income, when the norm for a school teacher around the world is between 1 and 2 times per capita income. Now, the US per capita income is $40,000 roughly. So it's like a school teacher, primary school teacher, earning $280,000 per year. So it's not for lack of money that this problem exists. Now, governance failure has 2 aspects. One is the institutional aspect. That is to say that if you could punish an absentee school teacher, all the other school teachers would show up the next day. But it also has a moral dimension, that if they did show up, would they teach with inspiration, saying that teaching is my dharma, that I'm preparing the next generation for of leaders in the country? So I was concerned by the moral dimension. And this is why I turned to the Mahabharat. Now, why the Mahabharat? Because one, the Mahabharat is unique in engaging with the world of politics. Two, it is obsessed with dharma. Unlike the Greek epics, where if say, Achilles does something wrong to Hector in the Iliad, well, he gets on with it. In the Mahabharat, the action stops and the argumentative Indian takes over, and you have everybody expressing their point of view. Oh, this was wrong. No, this was wrong. And thirdly, nobody in the epic asks, let's ask God for what is right and wrong. You know, dharma can mean many things. It can mean duty, it can mean law, it can mean goodness, virtue. But think about it as doing the right thing. And the notion of dharma in the Mahabharata is a pragmatic notion. And therefore, it is especially suited for policymakers. It does not seek moral perfection. So, my book, The Difficulty of Being Good, is one man's search for dharma in the 21st century, to make some sort of sense out of my life and maybe help others do the same. How does my strategy work? Well, the story of the Mahabharata is a story of rivalry within a royal family. And it's a rivalry between the children of two brothers. The good ones are called the Pandavas, and the bad ones are called the Kauravas. And the kingdom is divided in order to contain the rivalry. And the worst half is given to the good guys, the Pandavas. But the Pandavas are hardworking, diligent, intelligent. They are like people in this room. And they clear the forest, they build a new capital, they expand their territories, they have the most talented warrior of the time on their side, their brother, Arjun. And suddenly they've become very powerful. And they're so powerful that now they're considered the most powerful kingdom on the earth. And the eldest brother is told that now he can have the Rajasuya ceremony, consecrating him emperor, king of kings. And to this ceremony are invited the kings who bring in tribute, nobles, and also invited is the eldest brother from the other side, the Kauravas. His name is Duryodhan. And when he sees all this wealth and power of the Pandavas, he grows envious. And his uncle, who is accompanying him, asks, "My lord, you grow pale and sick." And he says, "What man of mettle will stand to see his neighbor prosper and himself decline. And in that line, he has captured the awful nature of envy, a moral sentiment that afflicts us all, without exception. I mean, we don't like to admit it. You know, when our friends do well, we go up and say, well done. But inside, we feel diminished. We don't like it. We can sympathize with jealousy, because jealousy is when I'm afraid that my wife may run away with my friend, and you'll sympathize with me. But envy, just because someone's doing well, my neighbor's doing well, that I should feel bad, is pretty awful. And it comes very early. When I was 5 years old, there was a boy in our neighborhood who had a red toy engine. And one day, when he was not looking, I broke it. They did a survey at Harvard with the graduating class of 1987, and they asked, would you rather earn $100,000 a year or $50,000? Everybody said $100,000. But then they put a condition that if you are earning $100,000, then your friends would be earning $200,000. But if you are earning 50, then your friends would be earning 25. Do you know 83% of the people switched their answer, saying that they would prefer to earn 50? And when you think about this problem today of CEO salaries, Wall Street bonuses that are in the news all the time, they are not related necessarily to reward or performance or need. They are related to envy. The fact that a board will say, we don't want our CEO earning less than our competitor's CEO. When I grew up, I ran the Proctor Gamble company in Bombay, and our factory was next to the factory of Philips, the Dutch company. That factory had been on strike for a whole year, and we were worried what was going to happen to us. And one day, I heard that the the union leader of the Philips factory told his workers that I don't care if we ever open this factory again, as long as the Dutch factory manager goes down. We have recently had a very celebrated fight between two brothers of the most famous business family in India, the Ambanis. And, you know, envy has a good side too, because it wants to make you compete. The newspapers call this fight greed. But I felt that it was really the younger brother's desire for the world to believe that he was as good as his elder brother. And so in the good side was the younger brother built a lot of good companies, like Reliance Capital. However, in the last couple of years, it became destructive. And I, as one of the 4.5 million shareholders of this company, Reliance, was very worried that the younger brother now was only interested in bringing the older brother down rather than building his companies. Anyway, in the 1930s, let's go back to Germany of the 1930s. I was not able to understand why Hitler was able to sway decent middle-class Germans to do the most awful things to the Jews, until I read that more than 50% of the professionals of Berlin and Vienna were Jews, when Jews represented only 5% of the population, and more than 65% of the doctors were Jews. So you can see that society was seething with envy. Anyway, let's come back to the Mahabharat. So Shakuni, the uncle, says to Duryodhan, look, these guys have become too powerful. We cannot take them on in a straight fight. So we'll have to use strategy. And what does he mean? He says, I'm the greatest dice player in the world. And Yudhishthir, the emperor, the elder brother on the other side, is the worst. But he's addicted to gambling. And moreover, you cannot lose because I cheat and nobody knows how. And sure enough, they hold a great dice match, and the hall is full of nobles and kings, and Yudhishthir loses everything. He loses his slaves, his horses, his armies, his entire kingdom, and then he loses his brothers, himself, and finally his wife. To humiliate the Pandavas, the good guys, the bad guys drag in the queen, their wife. And her name is Draupadi. And they call her their slave. And they jeer. But she's no weeping queen. She asks, did my husband lose himself first or me first? Immediately they've sensed a trap, because he had lost himself first, which means by the law he was incompetent to gamble her, because he did not possess anything that he could gamble. But the Kauravas are not going to be stopped by these legal niceties, and so one of them says, strip her. And the younger brother gets up and starts pulling her sari. But this sari begins to extend infinitely. And so after half an hour of pulling and huffing and puffing, he sits down humiliated. When the Mahabharat was being shown on television in the 90s, it was the most popular show ever. It was in 104 parts, 104 weeks, and the traffic would stop all over India when it was shown, and 600 million people watched it. And one inventive Gujarati company decided to market a Draupadi collection of saris. However, those saris did not extend infinitely, and so the company failed to gain market share. At this point, Draupadi gets very angry. And she looks at these rulers, especially at the elders, Bhishma, who's the grandfather of both sides. And she says, "How did you let this happen? And tell me, what is the Dharma of the king?" And this happens all the time in the Mahabharat, when we are being shown a mirror to look at ourselves. And certainly absentee school teachers or Bernie Madoff or any of the illustrious people we know will find their place in that mirror. However, Draupadi she's still angry, and she quotes a sage who says that when a crime is committed, half the punishment goes to the person who commits the crime, a quarter of the punishment goes to his ally, but a quarter of the punishment goes to those who remain silent. And again she looks at the grandfather and at the elders, and everybody remains silent. Now, when I was working on this chapter, the election for the President of India was taking place. The President of India's office is a largely ceremonial office, like the Queen of England. The power is with the Prime Minister. A month before the election, we began to hear disturbing reports about the background of the candidate who had been nominated by the ruling party for this job. They had nominated a woman, and we were delighted. But we heard that her husband had been implicated in some murder in Maharashtra, which had never gone to trial. We heard that the family owned a bank, and the bank had gone bust. And the Indian Express reproduced the letter of the liquidator of the bank, which said that the bank went bankrupt because the family members had taken huge loans with no intention of paying them back. So some of us were very, very disturbed by all this. And I was writing a column, a weekly column in the Times of India on Sundays. And I wrote a column which was an open letter to the Prime Minister saying, "Don't be silent." I quoted this story of Draupadi and the sari, which everybody recognizes in India. And then I also quoted what the sage had said, that 1/4 of the punishment will go to those who are silent. And so I said to the Prime Minister, for God's sakes, there's still a week left. It's not too late. Nominate another woman. Of course, a week later, nothing happened. She became our president and replaced the most popular president in Indian history, Abdul Kalam. But that day, many of us felt diminished. However, after that day, no one mentioned the background of this lady, which is a tribute to the Indian press of a certain restraint, that out of respect for the office, they did not mention it again, which could be good advice for Fox News, for example. So let's come back to the Mahabharat. Now, the Pandavas are in the forest, and they have been exiled for losing this game for 13 years. And the queen, Draupadi, they're in a jungle, and she sees her husband sleeping on the hard earth. And she says, "My heart weeps for you. You who always slept on sheets of silk and pillows of down," they had goose down pillows in those days too, "who had thousands of retainers, and now look at you. And is this what the world is all about? Why must the good suffer and the bad live in mansions and palaces?" This was very similar. What she says is the question that last year an Indian lady who was an exporter, she lost her job in an exporting company during the global financial crisis. And she asked me the same question. She says, "Why did I lose my job when it was those guys on Wall Street who created all this problem?" And of course, this is a classic issue about unmerited suffering. And this is something that the Mahabharat gets quite involved with. But Draupadi, she has a bias for action and tells her husband, "Now let's get an army together and you go and win back our kingdom that was stolen in a rigged game of dice." And she says, "It is your dharma, your duty. You are a warrior. And a warrior's calling is to fight a just war, and our cause is just." But he says, "No. My dharma is that I've given my word." And so you see how the Mahabharat immediately presents you with a clash of two meanings of dharma. One is a social meaning, virtue of a warrior or kshatriya, and the second is an internal, personal virtue. I've given my word. And this clash of the meanings of dharma actually drives the story forward. The next day, their uncle arrives in the forest. He's a good man. He had tried to prevent this rigged game of dice taking place, but he had not succeeded. They ask him, his name is Vidura. Some of you will remember Vidur Niti. So they ask him, "Tell us, what's the meaning of dharma? How do you judge dharma?" And she's really very upset with her husband because she can't figure out, is he being a coward or what? And he says, "Well, the way I judge dharma is to see the consequences of the action. So if an action helps the people, well, then that's dharma. If it harms the people, the praja, then it is adharma." And so she's still very confused because her husband is not looking at the consequences of any action. He's talking about his own personal, having given his word, his personal intentions. And of course, the Mahabharata has hit upon the classical discussion. Those of you who have studied philosophy will recognize this is a classical difference of how you judge what is right. Either you look at the results or you look at the intention of the actor. And to understand this for myself, I read in the Times of India a few years ago that a child was drowning off the beach in Goa. And a young man jumped in and saved this child. The reporter from the newspaper went up to this young man and he asked, "You're a hero. Why did you do it?" And he looked at her sheepishly and he said, well, we are a college group out on a holiday, and I was frankly trying to impress one of the girls in our group. And then she says, but then you're not a hero. But Vidura would have said, the child was saved. Dharma was done. However, Yudhishthira would have jumped in even if nobody was looking. So you see how this epic helps us to improve our moral reasoning. Unlike the Christian tradition, where you have 10 commandments, and you can go to the 10 commandments to give you an answer about right and wrong, here we don't know, and we have to reason it out. And good reasoning, I believe, is the foundation of good moral action. Anyway, 13 years go by, and now the Pandavas return back from exile to reclaim their kingdom. But the Kauravas, Duryodhana refuses. And so a war becomes inevitable. And the Pandavas declare war. On the first day of the battle, the commander of the Pandavas, Arjuna, who I said was the greatest fighter in the world, he asks his charioteer, who is Krishna, the god, says, lead me to a place where I can see both the armies. And then he sees on the enemy side his uncles, he sees his grandfather, his teacher, he sees people he played ball with when he was young. And he gets filled with despair. He says, I cannot kill them. And he puts down his bow. And the poor charioteer God has the unenviable job of convincing this commander to go and kill in the next 700 fratricidal verses, which are called the Bhagavad Gita. This question of who is right, Arjuna, who says, I won't fight, and Krishna, the charioteer, who says it's your duty to fight, and gives him, besides lots of other reasons, is a celebrated moment. And we have been debating this in India for centuries. Mostly Krishna wins, mainly because he's God, not for the strength of his arguments. A few years ago, the Pentagon invited me to come and speak about the economic rise of India. And one of the generals in the Pentagon had read about this episode, and he asked me that how is it possible that the great commander suddenly should go funk and put down his bow and not fight? He said it's as though Eisenhower, before the Normandy landings, had told his driver that I'm not going to fight. I explained to him that Arjuna is not just a general, not just a commander. He is also the political leader. He is one of the persons who was in the war cabinet the night before when the Pandavas declared war. He's one of the brothers. And for me, this episode is telling us that we want our political leaders to at least consider the moral dimension when they take us to wars. Now, Mr. Bush took you to a war in Iraq a few years ago, and there must have been a war cabinet meeting the night before, and Mr. Cheney, Mr. Rumsfeld, Mr. Wolfowitz, all the distinguished members of the cabinet were there. And they must have debated the economic consequences of the war, the political consequences of the war, the oil in Iraq, Israel, Palestine, all those considerations. But I bet you no one said that night that tomorrow we are going to fight, where we are going to kill lots of people, including civilians will die, and including our own people will die. Now, they may still take us to wars, our political leaders. But before they do that, what this episode is illustrating is the importance of also considering the dharma of the battle. Anyway, the Mahabharat is a very dark story. And before I close, let me just talk about my favorite character, who is everyone's favorite character in the Mahabharat, and it's Karna. Karna was born illegitimately to Kunti, who's the mother of the Pandavas, the good guys. She had been given a boon when she was a child, that she could have a child if she was childless from a god. And before she got married, she was experimenting with this mantra, and suddenly, 9 months later, she has a baby. She has been looking at the sun when she gives it. So the sun god has fathered a baby, and she's horrified. So she puts this, she's very sad, but she puts this baby in a basket, covers him up nicely, and floats him down the river where he's picked up by a charioteer. And so this royal prince grows up, Karna, grows up as a charioteer's son. But he is ambitious, hugely talented, and if at that time you were ambitious and talented, you wanted to be the greatest warrior. And that's what he becomes, the greatest warrior on the earth, even greater than Arjuna. However, he's treated by everybody as a low-caste person, as a son of a charioteer. And he's constantly slighted. He's never invited to any dinners or any gatherings. He falls in love with Draupadi. This is before she married the Pandavas. Draupadi is a beautiful woman. Dozens of nobles and princes are vying for her hand, and her father decides in a contest. And the contest is that you have to lift a very heavy bow and strike at a moving target. And all of them fail except Karna. So he thinks he has won a royal princess, and he goes up to her to be now declared her husband. But when he puts his head down, she says, I won't marry a Sutaputra. Sutaputra means charioteer's son. And even today, when a high caste person wants to insult a low caste person in a village in India, he calls him a Sutaputra. Apart from being a story about being low caste in a caste society. Karna's story has a more universal significance for all of us because it shows that all human beings want to be somebody. They don't want to be nobody. They certainly don't want to be treated like a nobody. And, when we are babies, there's no problem. Whether we cry, we break our toys, we burp, our mothers love us. But when we grow up, we are judged. We are judged for our achievements, we are judged for our position, our status. That's why my chapter in the book is called Karna's Status Anxiety. This status anxiety is a problem the problem is that our self-esteem is held hostage to the opinion of others. And that's why my friend's aunt used to say that you wouldn't worry so much what others think of you if only you realized that they don't. They are thinking what others are thinking of them. Those others are thinking what others are thinking of them. And nobody's thinking about you. And yet, for me, I'm always thinking, what is he thinking about me? I go into a hospital and I want the Times of India, Sunday Times of India is on the table, on the nurse's station. And I want the nurse to open the page where my column is. So she knows I'm somebody. When my first book was successful, India Unbound, we started getting invitations from all kinds of hostesses in Delhi. And my wife said that your next book better be a success also, otherwise we'll stop getting these invitations. Anyway, the Mahabharat is a dark story. There's a war. Everybody dies in the end. And the victors have to rule over an empty kingdom. But there are moments when the Mahabharat snatches victory from this darkness. Now, remember I told you when the war became inevitable, Krishna, who is also the master strategist of the Pandavas, he realizes that, my God, these good guys are going to lose this war because of Karna is on the other side. And so he goes to Karna and tells him who he is. And for the first time, Karna realizes that he is not a charioteer's son, but he's a kshatriya, a warrior. Not only a kshatriya, a royal kshatriya. Not only royal kshatriya, but the eldest son. And Krishna says, with you and Arjuna on our side, we are going to conquer the earth and win this war. And you will be king as the eldest brother. And Draupadi will be yours. Imagine being given everything that he had always wanted. But he refuses to switch sides. And he says to Krishna, the God, that your mother is not the one who gives birth to you, but the one who brings you up. And what a fine thing to say in a caste society. At the end of the epic, Yudhishthir, the king, the good man, he is walking to heaven. And on the way, a stray dog attaches itself to him. And together they walk to heaven, not looking at each other, looking straight. And when they reach heaven, Indra, the heaven keeper, comes out and he says, "Welcome, great king. We have waited for this moment." And Yudhishthira, instead of going in to heaven, he says, "But what about this dog?" And Indra says, "But he's not even your dog. He's just a dirty street dog. Besides, this is heaven. No dogs allowed." And Yudhishthira wonders, what sort of place is heaven where they don't even understand the ABC of Dharma? That if someone comes to you for refuge, you help them out. Now, I bet nobody in this room would have done what Yudhishthira did. Yet every child in every culture will understand the meaning of Dharma from this story. And so, what is the Mahabharat saying? It is saying that yes, it is a dark world. Yes, there is unmerited suffering, that poor people lose their jobs when Wall Street bankers do wrong things. Yes, it is very difficult to know Dharma, right or wrong. It's very difficult to know sometimes. You know, there's a wonderful story in the Mahabharat, and it's very similar to what happened 2 weeks ago when I was with my granddaughter. She heard her mother speak on the phone, and she said to her mother afterwards, "Mommy, you just told a lie." And I explained to her, no, actually she did a deed of dharma. What had happened was that the mother had told the woman on the other line, on the other side, she said, "I cannot come to your house for dinner because I'm sick." And she wasn't sick. And I explained to the little girl that she did not want to say to her that, "Look, you're a bore, your friends are bores, and I don't want to spend an evening with bores." And so I explained to her that your mother, there was a conflict of two duties: the duty to protect somebody and the duty to tell the truth. And so she told a lie, and this is called a white lie. And the Mahabharat says that civilization is based on white lies. Anyway, what the Mahabharat is finally, I think, telling us is that yes, it's a dark world, but an act of goodness is one of the few things that we possess. Thank you. Do we have time for questions?
I think we have some time for questions and answers, but I'd request you to repeat the question and then...
Okay, fine. Yes, sir.
There's something that's always bothered me, and I'm sorry I have to read your books, but in the Ramayana, where Rama gets rid of Sita, and have you dealt with that?
No, I have not dealt with Ramayana, and with the exception of this incident that you're talking, sorry, I should repeat the question. Have you dealt with the Ramayana in your book, was the question. And I said, no, I have not dealt with it. With the exception of this incident, the Mahabharat, the Ramayana actually is quite boring. It has the hero is perfect, the wife of the hero is perfect, The brother of the hero is perfect. Even the villain is perfect. Yes, sir.
You say doing good is difficult. How do you define difficult, and so what if it is difficult?
Well, the question is, the title of my book is The Difficulty of Being Good, and he's questioning, why is it difficult to be good? Well, to begin with, knowing right and wrong is not like learning the names of the rivers of the United States. Secondly, as my little granddaughter was confused, constantly in the epic, the characters get confused. And when Bhishma has this problem, Bhishma is the grandfather who remained silent when Draupadi was being disrobed. He is asked about dharma, and he says it is sukshma, meaning subtle. It is hard to know sometimes about right and wrong. And moreover, this is not a how-to book. It's not going to end up on that portion of the bookshelf, nor will the Mahabharat. And in this day and age, we live in a time of crisis. And the Mahabharat was written in a time of crisis. The crisis in our age is the fundamentalist challenge. That is, there are too many people who believe that they have the monopoly on the truth, and they're willing to kill for it. And the Mahabharat is a wonderful antidote, a good medicine for us all to take, because it says that there is no monopoly on the truth. And that if we want to build a world where there's tolerance, we just have to accept many truths. And one of the areas where there are many truths is the area of dharma. Yes, ma'am. What happened to the dog? Okay, wonderful. Well, Yudhishthira, when he refused to go to heaven, suddenly there's an epiphany, and the dog is transformed into the god Dharma, who turns out to be the father of Yudhishthira. You see, all these Pandavas were born from gods. Kunti had this boon, that she could give birth to children through gods. And, of course, it doesn't end there, because when he goes in, finally, because when he does go into heaven afterwards, he sees Duryodhana sitting there laughing on a throne in heaven. He gets very, very upset. And again he says, what kind of a place is heaven, where bad guys are sitting on thrones? And then he doesn't see his own wife, he doesn't see his brothers. And he says, where are they? And he's told that they are in hell. And he says, I'm not going to stay on any further in heaven. And so a messenger takes him down to hell. And then he sees his brothers and his wife. And he says, to the messenger, you can go back. I'm not going to stay. I'm not going to heaven. I'm staying here with them. And of course, this is another test. Like the first one was a test. Here's another test. And suddenly, then, of course, he was being tested. And they all go into heaven at the end. But he's explained that, look, you had to go to hell because you did wrong things too. You gambled away your kingdom and your wife. You beat one of the great generals of the Kauravas by telling a lie. And so the Mahabharata explains this very relative concept of heaven and hell, that actually that you have to spend time in heaven and hell depending on your karma. If you have lots of good karma, you spend most of your time in heaven. If you have bad karma, you spend most of your time in hell. So Duryodhan, they are told he's going to hell very soon, and he's going to stay there. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. In the beginning of your talk, you said that India is growing middle class.
Right.
In one of your pieces, you mentioned that in spite of the government, India is doing middle class.
Yes. In fact, I say, sorry to interrupt you, the statement which Farid Zakaria quoted me on was, our economy grows at night when the government is asleep. Yes, continue.
And I read your piece because I think it came up with one of
Okay.
But the question, I'm just wondering, in this kind of growing middle class society, where is the place of Mahabharat? How is Mahabharat playing out?
Yeah, and I think what you're really, this is a question, the place of Mahabharat in contemporary, rising India. And what you're really asking is, where's the place for Dharma? And in the middle class, is the middle class aware of Dharma? And usually the critics of the middle class say it's crass, consumerist, wants to get ahead, forgets everybody, and trods over the poor. That's the stereotype. Well, I think that the problem is not so much with the middle class. The problem is with our institutions. That more important now than even economic reforms is to reform the institutions of the state, such as the bureaucracy, to make it more accountable, so that absentee school teachers will show up. And I don't mean to beat on the teachers. I've just seen Waiting for Superman. I don't know if any of you have seen that. The fact of the matter is, we need reforms of the police, the judiciary, the parliament. And so, if we had been sitting here in 1970, we would have complained about the economy, about growth. But we would have been very proud of those institutions. Now, we have growth, but we are very disappointed with our institutions. And that's really the critical job today that we need to do. And that's why I just wrote this piece in there was a review I did in the Wall Street Journal of a book by Robert Kaplan, whose thesis is, this is the guy who writes in the Atlantic Monthly, and he's written a book called Monsoon. And it's about, he says that, of course, the rivalry in the 21st century will be between United States, India, and China. But he goes further to say that it will happen in the Indian Ocean, somehow Indian Ocean. So it's all about that. But in this piece that I wrote, the last paragraph was precisely addressing your question, that, I don't believe personally there's a race between India and China. But if there is a race, it is not about which country will get rich first. Both countries will become prosperous and middle class. The race will be decided by the fact if India is able to fix its governance first, or China is able to fix its politics first. China, to achieve dharma in a society, China the fact is the human heart requires liberty, and China does not have liberty. So China needs to figure out a way to get liberty. In India, we have liberty, but we don't have governance. So what this shows to you is that if we fix our governance first, we will win the race. The race not only of being successful, but also having dharma in our society. What this shows you is that it's not enough to have democracy. It's not enough to be a rapidly growing, prosperous society. You also need good governance. Yes, sir, at the back.
Follow on to that comment and question. If you apply the Mahabharat, the example you gave, 25% blame goes to those who want salvation.
Yes.
In this setting, you argue that the Indian public, at some level, is watching or there's something accept this.
Yeah.
And for the institutions to be fixed, in a sense, the cultural context needs to be changed. What do you see as the things that are enabled that?
Okay. Excellent question. Basically, what he's asking is that how are we going to fix the institutions of governance, really? And I think actually the growth of the middle class could be one answer. That the middle class will be unwilling to be silent. They're more impatient, they're more articulate, and if once 50% of India becomes middle class, which will happen between 2020 and 2025, then the politics of the country will also change. That's one hope. A second hope is that we are lucky. You talked about the role of luck in our lives. That China was lucky to have dengue, and Britain, which had very great corruption in the 19th century, early 19th century, you could buy a seat in parliament, you could buy any job in the government. Well, then they were lucky to have people like Disraeli and Gladstone, and they fixed some of these problems. And in this century, many of us don't like Margaret Thatcher, but she actually made the British government a lot more accountable to the people. And so we could be lucky in that way. But there's another way, and that is to go around the problem. And that is that the fact that economic reforms themselves have reduced corruption in the society. We all have cell phones. Now, India is actually about to cross China in the number of cell phones that exist in the country. More than 620 million cell phones are there, growing at 10 million a month. And there are people today, India had only 1 million telephones in 1980, 5 million in 1990. Today, 620 million. And 90% of the people have never had a landline in their life. They've just jumped. So, what this reform of the telecom sector, they never knew that to get a telephone in the old days, you had to bribe somebody in the government to get a telephone. So in this way, for example, railway tickets were a source of great corruption. One monopoly railway company of the government, but then they put it on the internet. So if they put birth certificates, driver's licenses, renewals, and all these things, the more they put on the internet, the more we'll get around the bureaucracy. Anyway, long-winded answer to a good question. Yes, madam.
I wanted to ask you, you've obviously spent so much time reading.
Shall we make this the last question? Yes.
Good, I wanted it to be the last question.
The last word.
I wanted to understand how the book changed you, writing this book. How did it change you?
Yeah.
That you did so much research and went into depth about Dharma and all the details that the Mahabharat talks about.
Yeah.
And secondly, I wanted you to recommend a version of Mahabharata
Yeah. Okay. That's both very good questions. She says, are you a better human being because of the Mahabharat? Or she says, what's a good translation of the Mahabharat to read? I took early retirement at 50 from my corporate career, as Anu told you. And after that, there are stages of the Indian life. And when you take retirement, then you enter the third stage of your life, which is a stage when you try to look for answers. Literally, it means vanaprastha ashrama, which means third, which means going into the jungles, because that's what you did in the old days. You went into the jungles I went to Chicago to read the Mahabharat. But my books are first trying for me to figure out the world for myself. Chinese Mandarins call this self-cultivation. But secondly, I would say that I am not a better person after reading the Mahabharata. I'm sorry to say this, but I am more sensitive to the moral dimension in our lives, so that I see, when everybody calls it greed on Wall Street or this, I am able to see some more nuances and layers in that. For example, I'm actually able to see that the capitalist system has more people believe that capitalism is efficient, but it's not moral. I've actually begun to believe that there's a real moral foundation of dharma. There's a real dharma of capitalism, which is what I would have spoken about. Maybe you'll invite me again to talk about that another year. So, what I'm trying to say is that it's, in a way, I was disappointed because I had also thought that I would find some answers, like a 10 Commandments. And I was left in a state of ambivalence and realized it's actually difficult. And this is where a woman, in Delhi, she went to the bookstore and wanted to return my book to the bookseller. And he asked her, this is Bahari and Sons in Khan Market, if you know Delhi, and he asked her, he said, but why do you want to return the book? And she says, look, I expected to become good as a result of this book. And so I think that, in a sense, just as dharma is its own reward, working on this book was its own reward. And I would never be able to know exactly what that is. So,
I have a question. May I make a comment? Because first of all, I wanted to say a wonderful talk, a masterfully presentation. It's remarkable. But I think you slightly misspoke about Christianity. Because the Mosaic law is the Hebrew law, and the Christian law was closer to what you just said about Dharma. When Jesus was asked to summarize the law and the prophets, this is what he said. There are only 2 commandments: love God and love your neighbor.
Well, that's dharma, certainly. Thank you for that.
Your recommendation you had one you told me about. The recommendation.
The recommendation for the Mahabharat. This is again very frustrating. I would recommend a volume of Mahabharat has just come out in the Penguin Classics. It's 800 pages, paperback, and the translator is John H. Smith. And that's the one I would recommend. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. You opened the door for me.
Thank you. My name is Anne McCrow. I'm the director of the UC Santa Cruz Foundation. And on behalf of the foundation, I want to thank our distinguished speaker, Gurcharan Das, for coming today to give his insights and wisdom for the Matra lecture. And I also want to thank all of you for being here today. I want to invite you to come to the stage afterwards. We're going to set up a table here. There'll be copies of the book, The Difficulty of Being Good, available. And Mr. Das has kindly agreed to sign copies. We also have a reception, which unfortunately we'd hoped to have out on the plaza, but because of the weather, it will be in the lobby, which is why we're putting the table here for the books on stage. So thank you for coming. I have one final quick announcement. Next Saturday, October 23rd, there will be a concert of classical Indian music sponsored by our music department, our classical Indian music program, of Purnima Chowdhury, a singer who happens to be the aunt of Sid Maitra, Anu's husband. So she will be performing at the Rio Theater next Saturday, 23rd October, at I'm looking at the time, but I don't. 7:30. Thank you, Anu. So. With that, please join us for refreshment in the lobby, and we will have books available here on the stage. Thank you very much.